Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we cut through the noise, really sift through the data, and give you the clearest, most engaging breakdown of the stories that truly matters. Today, we're plunging into a really high-stakes legal and political battle that's been brewing in Mexico. It's a case that puts electoral integrity, free speech, and the vital protection against gender-based violence. Puts them all in this complex, high-stakes standoff.
It really does. It hits on some fundamental tensions.
Yeah, exactly. So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack the intricate details of what's being called the Delgado versus INE case. We're drawing directly from a special report that focuses on electoral censorship and freedom of expression in Mexico.
A really detailed report, too.
It is. And we'll explore how a journalist's factual reporting, just stating facts about a Supreme Court candidate's marriage, was initially ordered removed by powerful electoral authorities. But then, later, it got overturned by Mexico's highest electoral court.
Quite the turnaround.
Totally. So we're going to dissect the various perspectives, look at the precise legal frameworks that were in play, and, the broader implications this has for journalism and democracy in Mexico.
Because this isn't just some minor legal skirmish, right?
Not at all. It's really a profound window into how information, power, and these crucial protective laws intersect, especially in the digital age. It offers you, the listener, some really crucial insights into the ongoing challenges of maintaining transparency and open discourse.
It's a fascinating one. It definitely has layers.
It really is. So let's get into it. Okay, let's unpack this initial incident.
Sure.
Imagine a powerful electoral body, right? The one responsible for ensuring fair elections.
The INE in this case.
Exactly, the INE. Imagine them ordering a journalist to remove content about a Supreme Court candidate, and the reason they give. They cite a law designed to protect against gender-based violence.
Yeah.
That's where our deep dive begins.
Yeah.
Mexico, just a few months ago. It's a scenario that immediately, makes you raise your eyebrows, doesn't it?
It absolutely does, because the immediate tension here, it springs from this clash of what are, in isolation, two really fundamental principles.
Right. Free speech on one side.
Exactly. You have the unassailable right to freedom of expression, the public's right to know, especially about public figures, political candidates, whose decisions affect millions. That's one pillar.
Okay.
But then on the other side, you have these critical laws designed to prevent real harm, specifically gender-based political violence, or VPMRG, as it's known there.
VPMRG.
And these laws are vital, absolutely vital, for ensuring women can participate equitably in democracy, protecting them from targeted attacks in what's historically been a very male-dominated political arena.
So two important goals seemingly in conflict here.
Precisely. And the core question that just popped up almost immediately in this case was, how do these two essential pillars coexist? Especially when one seems, at first glance anyway, to impinge directly on the other. What happens when a fact, just a plain fact, however inconvenient it might be, is perceived by someone as a form of harm?
And it all kicked off with a tweet, which, we've seen this happen so often now in our digital age, right? A single tweet can just explode into a national flashpoint.
The speed is incredible.
So on May 24th, 2025, this journalist, Álvaro Delgado Gómez, who's a pretty well-known figure in Mexican investigative journalism, right?
Yes, he's got a reputation.
He took to X, formerly Twitter, to publicly denounce an order he'd received from the National Electoral Institute, the INE.
Mexico's big electoral oversight body.
Right. And this wasn't like a subtle suggestion. It was a formal order targeting a video and several related posts by his digital outlet, Sin Embargo MX.
Which is known for being quite critical, an independent platform.
Exactly. So he gets this formal order.
And what's particularly significant here isn't just the order itself, but how Delgado chose to frame it, right?
Yeah, tell us about that.
He didn't just, report, oh, we got this order. He immediately called it out as direct censorship. And he specifically named the INE president, Guadalupe Tadei. That's quite pointed.
Wow. Okay, so naming names from the start.
Absolutely. And the content in question, it focused on Magda Zulema Mosri Gutiérrez. She's a highly placed magistrate, and at that moment was a candidate for Mexico's Supreme Court of Justice, the SCJN.
A very high-profile position.
Extremely.
Yeah.
And specifically, the Sin Embargo report highlighted her marriage to Rafael Macedo de la Concha. Now, he's a figure with a pretty controversial past. He served as Attorney General from 2000 to 2005 under President Vicente Fox.
Okay, so a known political figure may be controversial.
Very. We'll get into why later, but yes. So Delgado's critical question to the public, posed right there in his tweet, was sharp. Could merely mentioning a marriage, a verifiable public fact, could that genuinely constitute violencia política en razón de género, VPMRG, political gender-based violence?
So you put the question right out there.
Yeah.
Is stating a fact violence?
That was the challenge he threw down.
So his tweet immediately shifted the whole narrative, didn't it? It went from what might have looked like some kind of administrative directive.
Right, a bureaucratic thing.
To suddenly being this full-blown, high-stakes debate about journalistic freedom versus what he clearly saw as the, well, maybe overzealous application of these protective laws. That immediate reaction, that bold framing by Delgado, it essentially just lit a fuse, didn't it?
Precisely. It ignited a public debate that really resonated deeply. It pitted the essential freedom of the press, the right of journalists to report on publicly available facts, especially concerning public figures, against these critical and necessary laws designed to protect against gender-based violence in politics.
So the core question wasn't just about this specific video or tweet.
No, it became much bigger. It became about the definition of violence in public discourse and the appropriate application of these protective laws. Where do you draw the line?
Right.
And this incident, it just vividly demonstrates how quickly a single strategically framed tweet revealing an institutional order like that can become a major flashpoint for these huge national discussions about fundamental rights. It really highlights maybe the fragility of information flow in a highly charged political environment. And it demands immediate clarity on these really deeply held democratic principles.
Okay, so to truly understand the gravity here and all the nuances, we really need to meet the main characters in this unfolding drama. We've touched on them briefly, but let's dive deeper into their roles and, critically, their underlying motivations. So what does this all mean for each person involved? What drove their actions?
Absolutely. Understanding the key players and, their motivations isn't just helpful, it's crucial for grasping the true complexity of a case like this. It's never simple.
Right.
Let's start with Magda Zulema Mosri Gutiérrez. She was the complainant, the one who filed the initial action.
Okay.
She holds a really significant and influential position. She's a Federal Tribunal of Administrative Justice magistrate. And at the time of this incident, she was a very high-profile candidate for Mexico's Supreme Court of Justice, the SCJN, the highest court in the land.
Big deal.
Huge deal. Born in 1971, her background includes connections to the Institutional Revolutionary Party, the PRI. That's a key detail, given the political sensitivities in Mexico.
Okay, PRI connection.
And her husband, Rafael Macedo de la Concha, as we mentioned, he's, well, to put it mildly, a truly controversial figure in recent Mexican history.
Right. You said he was Attorney General under Fox.
Correct. From 2000 to 2005.
Yeah.
And he was famously involved in something called the Desafuero attempt against Andrés Manuel López Obrador back in 2005.
Okay, for our listeners, maybe explain the Desafuero. What exactly was that and why was it so controversial?
Sure. The Desafuero, it literally means stripping of immunity. It was this highly, highly politicized legal maneuver. The aim was to strip López Obrador, who was the mayor of Mexico City at the time and a leading presidential contender.
Ah, okay.
Strip him of his political immunity so he could face charges related to a, frankly, pretty minor land dispute.
Sounds political already.
Oh, absolutely. Many saw it as a transparent attempt to block him from running for president in 2006. Basically, remove him from the political race using the legal system.
Wow.
It generated massive public protests, huge marches in Mexico City, and it's really remembered as a dark chapter where the legal system was perceived by many, many people as being weaponized for political ends.
So Macedo de la Concha isn't just any public figure. He's tied to this really specific, politically charged moment.
Exactly. He's intimately connected to that event, so his past carries a lot of weight in Mexican politics.
Okay, so given that really charged background, what was Mosri's precise motivation for filing the complaint against an embargo MX? What was her argument?
So Mosri alleged that the content about her marriage constituted VPMRG political gender-based violence. Her argument was quite specific. She claimed that by consistently linking her professional merits, her candidacy, to her husband's identity and his past, especially his controversial history, that the reporting invoked and reinforced gender stereotypes. She felt it reduced her to just being the wife of this controversial figure.
Ah, okay. I see the argument.
Yeah, she argued it effectively undermined her professional standing, her independence, her individual qualifications for the Supreme Court. And this, she argued, amounted to violencia symbolica.
Symbolic violence, what does that mean exactly?
It's a concept where harm is caused not through direct physical acts or explicit insults, but through symbols, representations, or associations that subtly discredit or devalue someone, particularly based on stereotypes. In this case, gender stereotypes.
So the idea is that just linking her to him symbolically diminished her own achievements.
That was her argument, yes.
Yeah.
That it targets a person's image or reputation, subtly discrediting their individual achievements by framing them through the lens of a relationship or a stereotype, rather than on their own merit.
But I understand that critics, people in the media, political observers, they suggested a different motivation, or maybe an additional one.
Indeed. Critics quickly alleged that her complaint might have been more of a strategic move, an attempt to perhaps conceal or at least downplay these political ties and potential conflicts of interest.
Especially given her husband's past and her run for the Supreme Court.
Exactly. The timing here was absolutely crucial. This was all unfolding within the context of Mexico's 2024 judicial reform. That reform made any discussion of judicial candidates incredibly sensitive, highly scrutinized. There was this huge focus on ensuring an independent judiciary.
Right, the stakes were high for the judiciary itself.
Immense. So for critics, the complaint looked less like a genuine claim of gender-based violence and maybe more like an attempt to control a narrative that could have been politically inconvenient or even damaging to her candidacy.
That makes perfect sense. The stakes for her candidacy were just incredibly high, both for her public image and, her potential influence down the line. Okay, now let's look at the journalists, Álvaro Delgado Gómez and Sin Embargo MX. What were their roles and motivations in publishing this content in the first place?
Right. So Delgado and Sin Embargo MX, they represent an independent digital news outlet. They have a strong focus on investigative journalism, and they often take a pretty critical stance towards government and powerful figures.
Okay.
Their motivation in publishing the content as they presented it was really rooted in the principle of transparency.
Transparency.
Yeah. They aim to report on Mosri's candidacy, her historical ties to the PRI party, and significantly, her marriage to Mesero de la Concha. They framed these things as potentially relevant influences from past political regimes that, they argued, should be publicly known, especially for someone seeking a lifetime appointment to the highest court in the country.
Makes sense from a journalistic perspective.
And it's absolutely critical to stress this point, which the special report explicitly states the content itself contained no explicit gender-based attacks.
Right, you mentioned that. No insults, no slurs.
Nothing like that. Their focus was purely on shedding light on connections and background details they considered relevant to the public interest. Now, Delgado's personal motivation in then denouncing the INE's order so forcefully, that was clearly about upholding the fundamental principle of freedom of expression and exposing what he perceived as a clear act of censorship. He was pushing back against what he saw as an overreach of institutional power that could set a really dangerous precedent for all journalists in Mexico.
Okay, so defending press freedom was key for him. Now, what about the National Electoral Institute, the IN? They were the initial enforcer here. What was their role and their justification for issuing that removal order?
The INE is Mexico's autonomous body. It's constitutionally mandated with organizing elections, ensuring electoral equity, safeguarding a fair playing field for all candidates. That's their job.
A really important job.
Crucial. Their president, Guadalupe Today, was the one specifically named by Delgado in his criticism, you'll recall.
Right.
So on May 23rd, 2025, the INE granted Mosri's complaint. They issued an order for the removal of that YouTube video and the X posts from Sin Embargo MX. They invoked precautionary measures.
Precautionary measures. Okay.
And their stated argument was that this action was necessary to protect electoral equity and to protect the candidate, Mosri, from alleged gender-based political violence. So from their perspective, they were fulfilling their mandate. They were trying to create a fair and equitable electoral environment, particularly for female candidates who might face specific kinds of attacks and whose candidacies these VPMRG laws were specifically designed to protect.
So they saw themselves as applying the law as intended.
That was certainly their justification, yes.
And finally, the appellate body, the Electoral Tribunal of the Federal Judiciary, the TPJF. They're the ones who ultimately stepped in and made the critical decision, providing the corrective right.
Exactly. The TET-E-PJF. They are the highest electoral court in Mexico. They're charged with resolving electoral disputes and upholding constitutional principles, including, crucially, those pertaining to fundamental rights like free speech. Their key action came later, on August 20th, 2025, and it was decisive. They unanimously annulled the INE's initial order. They ruled decisively in favor of freedom of expression.
Unanimous. Okay. That's significant.
Very significant. Their motivation was clearly to reaffirm Mexico's constitutional protections for free speech and essentially to correct what they deemed an overreach by the INE in applying those anti-violence laws. They acted as that crucial check and balance within the system,
Right.
ensuring that protective measures, while vital, don't inadvertently become tools for censorship or stifle legitimate public inquiry into public figures. They drew a line.
So by understanding these different roles and their stated and maybe sometimes implied motivations, you can truly appreciate the intricate web of interests and fundamental principles that clashed in this pivotal case.
Absolutely.
It's not just a simple black and white issue at all. There are deep layers of intent, legal interpretation, constitutional weight from every single angle. This entire dynamic really illustrates how institutional actions, even those intended to protect, can just quickly spark a huge national dialogue on the very definitions of freedom and harm. Okay, so with the players and their motivations laid out, let's now cut to the chase. What exactly was in Sin Embargo's report that sparked such a firestorm? What was the actual content, and why did it become the centerpiece of this whole legal battle? Okay, let's unpack this content itself.
Right. This is where the core of the debate truly lies, because the factual basis of the reporting by Sin Embargo MX was, well, to put it plainly, verifiable and publicly available information.
Okay, so facts. What facts?
The central piece of information that the INE ordered removed was Magda Zulema Mosri Gutierrez's marriage to Rafael Macedo de la Concha.
Just the fact of the marriage.
Just the fact of the marriage. This wasn't speculation, it wasn't rumor, it was a corroborated fact. The report notes you could find this information readily in the public domain, public records. Even platforms like Wikipedia had it listed.
Okay, public knowledge.
Public knowledge. The Sin Embargo report also, as we mentioned, delved into Mosri's history with the PRI party and Macedo de la Concha's controversial role in that 2005 Desafuero attempt against López Obrador.
Right.
So the thrust of Sin Embargo's reporting was basically to highlight potential political influences and connections that they believed were relevant for public scrutiny, especially given Mosri's candidacy for a position as critical as Supreme Court Justice. They were connecting dots they saw as important.
And what's crucial here, something the report explicitly highlights, and it forms a central pillar of the defense argument, is that the content did not contain explicit gender-based attacks.
Exactly. That cannot be stressed enough.
It wasn't derogatory towards Mosri based on her gender.
Right.
Didn't use sexist language, no personal insults, nothing like that.
Correct. Its focus was squarely on transparency and exploring potential political influences and ties, which, for a Supreme Court candidate is arguably a very legitimate area of journalistic inquiry.
Seems like standard practice for covering high-level appointments.
Pretty much. However, despite the factual nature, Mosri's complaint alleged that the coverage still constituted violencia política and razón de género, VPMRG. Specifically, she labeled it as that violencia simbólica, symbolic violence.
Right, the symbolic violence argument again.
Yes. She argued that by linking her to her husband, particularly his past controversies, the reporting implicitly undermined her professional standing, her independence, her individual merits. And that, she argued, perpetuated gender stereotypes by reducing her identity to that of her husband's wife.
So even if the facts were true, the way they were presented, or just the fact they were presented, was the problem for her.
That was her argument. For her, the mere association, even if factual, was damaging because it forced her to be defined in the public eye by her relationship to a man, rather than by her own substantial career and qualifications.
Okay, so this symbolic violence idea, for listeners who might not be familiar, it's not about direct insults, right? It's a more subtle form of discrediting someone.
Exactly. It's not a physical attack. It's not explicit verbal abuse like name-calling. Instead, violencia symbolica subtly, often indirectly, denigrates or undervalues a person's worth, particularly a woman's, by framing her identity or achievements primarily through her connection to a man or by invoking traditional gender roles.
Okay.
It can be incredibly insidious because it might appear on the surface to be merely factual reporting. But the impact, the argument goes, is to diminish the individual woman's agency and autonomy. So Mosri's argument was, by constantly defining her candidacy in relation to Macedo's controversial past, The media was engaging in this subtle, gendered undermining.
But there was a strong counterargument to this, wasn't there? Many people, journalists, observers, they push back hard against this claim.
Oh, absolutely. Vehemently. They argued that reporting verifiable facts, even if those facts are politically inconvenient, even if they link a public figure to a controversial spouse, simply is not violence.
Right, that's a very different definition.
Completely. They stressed that if Mosri's interpretation stood, it would set an incredibly dangerous precedent. It could make it virtually impossible to report on the backgrounds, the connections, the potential conflicts of interest of female candidates without constantly fearing legal repercussions under the guise of gender violence.
Yeah, that sounds like a chilling effect.
Exactly. They argued that this conflates legitimate public interest reporting with a personal attack, blurring a line that's fundamental to press freedom.
Okay, so this debate quickly became about the very definition of violence in public discourse. Where do you draw that line between legitimate scrutiny and harmful gender-based aggression?
That's the million-dollar question it raised. And to understand why this particular case became such a flashpoint, we also need to put it in the context of Mexico's broader political landscape at the time.
Okay, what was going on?
Firstly, you had Mexico's 2024 judicial reform, enacted by President Claudia Sheinbaum. This reform aimed to significantly restructure the judiciary. That made any discussion around Supreme Court candidates incredibly sensitive, highly scrutinized. The public and political spheres were already deeply invested in the integrity and independence of judicial appointments.
So the entire judicial branch was basically under a microscope, and a Supreme Court candidate's background would naturally draw intense attention anyway.
Precisely. Huge spotlight. Then second, the 2025 elections themselves were already creating a politically charged environment. The report notes that there was already a discernible pattern emerging.
Okay.
Yeah, a pattern of various candidates invoking gender protections, these VPMRG laws, to challenge media coverage they didn't like. It suggested a broader trend, maybe a strategy, of these relatively new anti-violence laws being deployed as a tool against critical reporting.
So the Delgado case wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was part of a larger, evolving situation.
Exactly. It wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger, evolving strategy within political campaigns, it seems.
And of course, there's Macedo de la Concha's past. We talked about the Desafuero. His involvement in that attempt against López Obrador made him an incredibly controversial figure, right?
Hugely controversial. So for a judicial candidate like Mosri, any association with such a politically polarizing figure would inherently be politically charged. This wasn't just reporting on a marriage. It was reporting on a marriage to a figure whose history was deeply intertwined with a major political scandal. That added another significant layer of scrutiny and sensitivity to her candidacy. So you see this complex interplay, right? You've got verifiable facts clashing with accusations of harm, this nuanced concept of symbolic violence, and it's all happening against this broader backdrop of a highly charged political landscape with judicial reform and elections underway.
Yeah.
This segment truly highlights how easily public information can be reframed as a form of violence, sparking this profound national debate about the very definition of journalistic integrity versus harm in political discourse, especially when it involves individuals seeking high office in a volatile political climate. It really forces us to ask, what's the true cost of political transparency sometimes?
Okay, this case isn't just about a tweet or a candidate, is it? It's really a deep dive into Mexico's complex legal framework, balancing free speech and gender equality. And here's where it gets really interesting as we look at the specific laws that came into play and how they kind of created this tension.
Yeah, what's fascinating here is how these different laws, each designed with undoubtedly good and important intentions, can create these unintended tensions, significant challenges in their application, especially when they appear to clash head-on.
Right. Let's start with the free speech side. Mexico has constitutional guarantees, right?
Very clear and robust ones. They're foundational to its democratic system. Article 6 of the Mexican Constitution explicitly guarantees the free expression of ideas and, crucially, prohibits prior censorship.
Prior censorship meaning stopping speech before it happens.
Exactly. It's a direct constitutional firewall against preemptive government suppression of speech, not just punishing it after, but stopping it beforehand. And complementing this, you have Article 7, which protects publishing freedom on any subject. It affirms journalists' fundamental right to inform the public on matters concerning public figures and the public interest.
Okay, so Article 6 and 7 are the bedrock.
They really are. They represent the bedrock of press freedom in Mexico.
And it was these fundamental articles that the Electoral Tribunal, the techie PJF, ultimately relied upon to overturn the INE's order, correct?
Precisely. The TEPI-JF invoked these core constitutional provisions. They used them to overturn the INE's order, unequivocally deeming it an unconstitutional prior restraint. They essentially said, look, you cannot silence factual reporting before it's even fully disseminated, especially when it concerns public figures, without violating core constitutional principles.
Strong stance.
A very strong stance. It really underscores the Mexican judiciary's commitment at that highest level to preventing preemptive censorship.
Okay, but then on the other side of the coin, you have these laws against gender-based political violence, the VPMRG laws. They're also incredibly important and in many ways quite progressive, aren't they?
Indeed they are. And these laws are relatively recent but very powerful. They were born out of a genuine need to address the real problems of misogyny and gender-based discrimination in Mexican politics, which have historically been significant barriers for women.
Okay, so what do they actually say?
Well, there's the Ley General de Acceso de las Mujeres a una Vida Libre de Violencia. It's a bit of a mouthful.
Yeah, let's shorten that.
Let's maybe call it the General Law for Women's Access to a Life Free of Violence, or even just the Women's Anti-Violence Law for simplicity. Article 20B's in that law defines VPMRG very broadly.
How broad?
It includes pretty much any gender-based action or omission that undermines women's political rights, even through the use of stereotypes. That definition is crucial because it allows for legal action against more subtle forms of discrimination, like that violencia simbólica we discussed.
So it's designed intentionally to cast a wide net to try and truly protect women in the political sphere.
Exactly, that's the intent. Then you have another law, the Ley General en Materia de Delitos Electorales, the General Law on Electoral Crimes. Also Article 20B's in that one. This goes a step further by actually criminalizing VPMRG.
Criminalizing it? Wow.
Yes, with penalties that can include fines and even imprisonment up to 6 years. And importantly, this law grants the INER, a National Electoral Institute, the specific authority to issue those precautionary measures during elections to prevent harm.
Ah, so that's where the INE got the power to order the content removal.
That's the specific legal hook. These measures can include ordering the temporary removal of content, which is exactly what happened in the Delgado case.
So from the INE's perspective, looking at these laws, they were acting entirely within what they saw as their clear legal mandate.
Absolutely. And it's worth noting these VPMRG protections were significantly strengthened back in 2020 through a series of sweeping reforms. The explicit goal was to promote female participation in politics, to combat that long history of sexist attacks, misogynistic campaigns, discrimination, all the things that had historically deterred women from seeking or holding office in Mexico.
So a clear push for gender equality in politics.
Definitely. The intent was clearly to level the playing field. However, even back when these reforms were enacted, many legal experts and civil society groups raised concerns. They warned about the potential for overbroad application.
Meaning they could be used too widely.
Exactly. They feared that without really precise definitions and careful judicial oversight, these powerful new laws, while well-intentioned, could inadvertently be misused to suppress legitimate criticism or even just factual reporting that someone found inconvenient. And that's precisely the tension this Delgado case brought right to the forefront.
The exact scenario they were worried about seemed to play out.
It certainly seemed that way initially.
So the IND also had its own specific regulations and protocols for how to implement these general laws, right?
Yes, they do. The INE has its own regulations on precautionary measures. These explicitly permit temporary content removal to prevent harm in electoral processes. That was the specific legal basis, the justification for the INE's initial order to sin embargo MX. They also operate under a joint protocol for addressing VPMRG. This was developed together with the TEPJF, the High Court, and it provides detailed guidance for identifying what actually constitutes VPMRG.
Ah, so there's a guidebook, essentially.
There is. And this is where the TEPJF's ultimate ruling becomes particularly insightful, because the higher court, the TPJF, found that the sin embargo content did not contain a gender element as defined by this very protocol.
Wow. So the INE didn't follow its own guidebook, according to the higher court.
That's essentially what the TPJF concluded, that the INE, in their view, had misapplied its own guidelines in this specific instance. It's a critical detail. It really highlights the importance of precise legal interpretation and application.
So the very protocol designed to help identify gender-based violence was ultimately used by the higher court to say, Nope, this isn't it. This doesn't fit the definition you yourself are working with. That's quite a turnaround.
It absolutely is. And to add just one more layer of context here, the report also highlights that international standards, things like conventions and rulings from international bodies, also tend to emphasize damage based on gender for VPMRG.
Damage based on gender, what does that imply?
It implies a potentially higher bar. It suggests that merely mentioning a factual relationship or background information, even if it's politically inconvenient, isn't enough to trigger these kinds of protections unless there's an explicit gender-based attack, or unless there's concrete, verifiable harm that specifically targets a person because of their gender. The international consensus seems to lean towards a more stringent definition of what constitutes political violence against women, focusing on that gender-based animus.
Okay, so putting it all together, you gain this really concrete understanding of how different laws, designed for distinct important purposes, one to protect fundamental speech, the other to protect vulnerable groups, can not only collide, but how the constant challenge of balancing these competing rights falls squarely on judicial interpretation.
It's all about interpretation.
This case truly reveals how critical it is to define those boundaries precisely. You need to ensure that protective measures serve their intended purpose without inadvertently stifling the robust, sometimes uncomfortable discourse that's absolutely essential for a healthy democracy. It's a truly delicate and ongoing act of legal navigation, isn't it?
It really is a constant balancing act.
Okay, so once the INE's order was actually issued, those digital breadcrumbs, as we said, they quickly turned into a blaze. This wasn't just some quiet legal proceeding unfolding behind closed doors. It became a very public showdown. Let's trace the timeline of events that led to this major institutional conflict and eventually that significant ruling from the TTJF.
Yeah, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, the sheer speed of events here is incredibly telling. It demonstrates not only how quickly information can spread and controversies can ignite in the digital age,
Right.
but also how rapidly institutions can find themselves held accountable, at least in the court of public opinion, and then eventually in the actual courts.
Okay, so walk us through it. Where did it start?
It all began back in May 2025. That's when Cinembargo MX published its video and the related posts regarding Magda Zulema Mosri Gutierrez's marriage and her political background. The content, as we've discussed, aimed for transparency, but quickly drew that formal complaint from her.
Okay, content published, complaint filed. Then what?
Then, just a few days later, on May 23rd, 2025, the National Electoral Institute, the INE, issued its initial order. The order for the content's removal, citing those precautionary measures we just talked about.
Right, so that was the institutional hammer dropping, the official action.
Exactly. And this is precisely where Álvaro Delgado Gómez stepped in and just amplified the conflict dramatically. The very next day, May 24th, 2025, he published his now famous tweet, the one directly calling out the INE's action as censorship.
And that tweet took off.
Oh, it took off massively. The report says it accumulated over 594,000 views in really short order. It became a significant catalyst for public outcry and immediately ignited that national debate we've been discussing.
Wow, over 500,000 views quickly.
Yeah.
That's impact.
Huge impact. And the very next few days, May 25th, 27th, you saw this widespread and really vocal media backlash erupt. Article 19, which is a prominent international organization dedicated to defending freedom of expression.
Yeah, you mentioned them before.
They intervened swiftly and decisively. They issued a strong condemnation of the INE's actions. They labeled them inconstitucional as unconstitutional, and they explicitly warned that such measures foster chilling effects among journalists.
The chilling effect again, basically telling journalists to self-censor.
Exactly, warning them that they should perhaps shy away from sensitive topics for fear of facing similar legal repercussions. Article 19's statement carried a lot of weight, both domestically and internationally.
So it wasn't just Delgado pushing back. The public reaction was palpable, and it sounds like it was varied too, turning this into a real national conversation with voices speaking out from multiple corners.
Absolutely. Beyond Delgado's initial tweet, other prominent voices and social media users quickly weighed in. The report mentions posts from accounts like @Tanyard, for instance, swiftly surfacing online, supporting Delgado's stance and amplifying the message that this looked like a clear institutional overreach.
Okay, so support for Delgado.
Yes, but it's important to note, the public discourse wasn't entirely one-sided or universally sympathetic to the journalist. The report does indicate that some social media users also brought up accusations of maybe hypocrisy in gender claims in other related cases.
Oh, okay. So some skepticism, too.
Some skepticism, yeah. It suggested a divided public opinion on exactly how these anti-violence laws should be applied. It indicates a broader question among some people regarding how strategically these laws might sometimes be invoked in political disputes. And the report also highlights, as we touched on, that similar cases involving other figures like Leosa Wilkins and Hector de Mauleón had already kind of established a pattern of candidates invoking gender protections to challenge media coverage. So this Delgado case wasn't seen as totally unique, but rather part of this broader emerging trend where these laws were being tested and debated in public and legal arenas.
Got it. So a complex public reaction, and then came the crucial turning point, right? The moment of ultimate judicial oversight, the TEP-UAJF decision.
Yes, the decisive moment arrived on August 20th, 2025. That's when the Electoral Tribunal of the Federal Judiciary, the TEP-UPJF, delivered its unanimous decision.
Unanimous again.
Unanimous. And in a really powerful affirmation of constitutional rights, they annulled the INE's order. They ruled unequivocally that it violated freedom of expression.
So game over for the removal order.
Pretty much. As a direct and immediate consequence, the content that had been ordered removed the video, the posts it was restored. It signaled a significant victory for journalistic freedom and the principle of public transparency in this context. It was a swift, unanimous, and decisive correction by the highest electoral court. It really demonstrated the judiciary's role as that vital check on administrative power.
Okay, so the content went back up. But the story doesn't quite end there, even today, does it? The legal journey, I understand, continues in some form.
That's correct. As of August 31st, 2025, which is the today for this report, Álvaro Delgado himself provided an update on X. He noted that the case is still technically subject to an ongoing appeal.
Ah, okay. So it's not completely finalized.
It indicates that while the TEP-UPJF's ruling was a major win, and it set a very strong precedent, the full legal journey isn't definitively complete. There could potentially be further procedural developments or appeals moving through the system. However, the unanimity and the clarity of the TEP-UPJF's decision make any subsequent appeals seem like, well, an uphill battle for the original complainant, Mosri. The highest electoral court already spoke very clearly.
Right. Seems unlikely to be overturned again, given that unanimous ruling. So, through this timeline, you really witness this dynamic interplay, don't you? Between institutional power, media resistance, the shifting sands of public opinion, and then that crucial judicial oversight unfolding almost in real time.
It's a fascinating sequence.
The swiftness of both the backlash against the INE's order and the TEP-UPJF's unanimous decision to strike it down. It truly underscores the robust, albeit sometimes challenged, checks and balances within Mexico's democratic framework.
The system worked in this instance.
It really is a powerful illustration of how quickly these battles over fundamental rights can unfold and how crucial each step in the legal and public process can be in defining the future of public discourse and institutional power.
Okay, so this incident, as we've established, it goes far beyond just a single tweet or a single judicial decision. It's really a critical moment for understanding the broader landscape of media freedom, legal application, and democratic health in Mexico. So, drilling down on that, what does this all mean for freedom of speech, for journalism, and for the very health of democracy there in the long run?
Yeah, this incident truly raises that important, maybe uncomfortable question. How do we prevent laws that are designed with the best intentions in this case, for protection from inadvertently becoming tools for silencing legitimate inquiry? The implications here are significant and they're multi-layered.
Let's start with freedom of speech. What are the implications there?
Well, for freedom of speech, even with the eventual reversal by the TEP-UPJF, that initial order from the INE highlights a very real and persistent risk of prior censorship. Right. Even temporary censorship sends a message.
Exactly. This kind of action, even if it's temporary, can create a pervasive, chilling effect. We keep coming back to that term because it's so apt.
Where journalists basically get scared off.
Precisely. Where journalists, fearing similar repercussions, fearing lengthy and costly legal battles, might just engage in self-censorship. They might decide not to publish certain stories or details even if they're true and relevant. And this is particularly concerning when it comes to reporting on the personal details or political connections of female candidates, even if those details are factual and highly relevant to their public roles. They might think, is it worth the headache?
And this concern about self-censorship must be amplified in Mexico, right? I mean, it's not like journalists there operate in a completely safe or unburdened environment already.
Not even close. Mexico already operates within what's widely recognized as a high-risk media environment. Journalist killings, threats, judicial harassment, These are unfortunately common occurrences. It creates an already challenging and often downright dangerous climate for media professionals to work in.
So this just adds another layer of risk.
It potentially does. Organizations like Article 19, which we mentioned, defending free expression, they specifically and unequivocally condemned the INE's measures precisely for fostering these chilling effects. They recognized how such actions compound the pre-existing vulnerabilities of the press in Mexico.
Yep.
I mean, Mexico consistently ranks very low on the Reporters Without Borders, RSF, Press Freedom Index. It's often listed among the most dangerous countries in the world for journalists, sadly. So incidents like this, even when they're corrected by a higher court, unfortunately contribute to that perception, both domestically and internationally. It just makes it harder for journalists to do their vital work of informing the public without fear.
Okay, so on one hand, you have this fundamental right to free speech being directly challenged, or at least chilled. But then on the other hand, you have this broader and very necessary debate around the anti-violence laws themselves, the VPMRG laws, which are clearly designed for a good and essential purpose. How do we navigate that tension? It seems like the core conflict.
It really is the core conflict, and this is exactly where the conversation gets really nuanced and complex because both sides have valid points. Supporters of the VPMRG laws argue, quite rightly, that these laws are absolutely crucial. They're indispensable even.
Why indispensable?
Because they combat very real issues of sexist attacks, misogynistic campaigns, deeply ingrained discrimination, things that have historically prevented women from participating fully and equally in Mexican politics. These laws help prevent women from being undervalued, undermined, or, frankly, driven out of public life just because of their gender. They aim to ensure greater equity and participation.
So they were enacted to address a genuine systemic problem.
Absolutely. A very real problem in Mexico's political culture. They provide a necessary legal shield against gender-based political violence.
Okay, that makes sense. But the Delgado case really brought home the other side of that argument, didn't it? The potential risks of misapplication.
It did, starkly. The Delgado case exemplifies that critical risk of misapplying these powerful laws. When they are used or perceived to be used to suppress factual reporting, even if that reporting is politically sensitive, especially when there are no explicit gender-based attacks involved, well, it raises serious and fundamental questions about what truly constitutes violence in public debate.
Right. Is it just an uncomfortable truth being reported? Or is it genuinely harmful gender-based aggression aimed at diminishing a woman's public standing because she's a woman?
Exactly. The line becomes dangerously blurred, and if the definition of violence becomes too elastic, too subjective, it can be easily manipulated.
And it seems like various stakeholders, different groups in Mexico, are pretty divided on this very definition, right? It's not a settled issue.
Not at all. You have deep divisions. Some, including many women's rights advocates, view the robust application of these anti-violence laws as an absolutely necessary shield. They see it as essential to combat deeply entrenched stereotypes and ensure women can participate fully without fear of misogynistic targeting. They prioritize the protective aspect.
Okay. And the other side?
Others, including many journalists, civil society organizations focused on free speech, and legal analysts, see the kind of overreach perceived in the Delgado case as a direct threat to transparency. They see it as an unconstitutional overstep, particularly dangerous in the context of elections where public scrutiny of candidates is paramount for democracy.
So transparency versus protection, in a way.
That's often how the debate gets framed. And you have NGOs like R3D, which is a prominent digital rights defense network in Mexico. They highlight that electoral years in Mexico tend to exacerbate online restrictions and attempts at censorship anyway. So they argue that vigilance in these areas is even more crucial during election cycles. They're watching closely for misuse of these laws.
This all has broader implications then, not just for journalists, but for electoral transparency, and maybe even the independence of the judiciary itself, doesn't it?
Indeed. The consequences ripple outwards. If precautionary measures like the INE's initial order were not consistently and swiftly overturned by higher courts, well, that could significantly erode public trust in the entire electoral process.
How so?
Well, if electoral bodies are perceived as having the unchecked power to censor factual reporting whenever a candidate complains, it undermines the very idea of a transparent and fair election. How can citizens make informed choices if relevant information is being suppressed?
Good point. It damages the credibility of the process.
Exactly. Furthermore, the case really highlights the potential risks associated with a politicized judiciary, especially in the context of Mexico's recent judicial reforms, which aim to ensure independence but also sparked debate. If the courts, particularly the TPJF in this instance, were not independent enough, or if they lacked the constitutional resolve to correct the INE's overreach, the consequences for democracy, for judicial independence, for transparency, for fundamental rights could have been far more severe and lasting. The whole system relies on those checks and balances working.
So you're really prompted to consider the far-reaching consequences of institutional actions, aren't you? Even those that get eventually corrected. This discussion just illuminates the delicate, indeed often precarious balance societies have to strike. Protecting vulnerable groups from genuine harm versus safeguarding the robust, sometimes uncomfortable discourse that's absolutely essential for a healthy and accountable democracy. It's clearly not an easy line to walk, is it?
Not easy at all. And this case serves as a stark reminder of that ongoing challenge, that constant tension.
Okay, so after tracing this entire journey, from that controversial tweet all the way to the high-level judicial decision, how do we ultimately assess the overall severity of this incident? Was it a major setback for press freedom in Mexico, a near miss? Or was it actually a sign of resilience within its democratic institutions? How do we weigh these competing forces?
Yeah, that's the crucial assessment, isn't it? And if we connect this back to the bigger picture, this incident really served as a crucial stress test for Mexico's democratic institutions, particularly for that interplay between the electoral bodies, the media, and the judiciary.
A stress test, okay. How did it perform?
Well, when we evaluate its overall severity, we absolutely have to consider both the negative elements and the significant mitigating factors that ultimately came into play. It's not one or the other.
Okay, let's break that down. What were the negative elements?
On the negative side, the initial INE order, let's be clear, undeniably represented an abuse, or at least a serious misapplication, of the VPMRG legal framework in this instance, according to the higher court. It was a clear, unambiguous act of prior censorship against factual reporting. And that in itself is a direct and serious threat to journalistic freedom, especially, as we keep saying, given Mexico's already high-risk environment for the press.
Right. The initial action was bad.
It was bad. It highlighted the very real risk of widespread self-censorship spreading among media outlets. That fear factor could significantly erode electoral transparency by keeping important, publicly relevant information away from citizens. And in the broader context of those judicial reforms happening, it hinted at the profound risks of a potentially politicized judiciary if such administrative decisions were allowed to stand unchecked. These are not minor concerns, they're fundamental democratic health issues.
Okay, so those are significant, definitely concerning aspects of the incident. But you mentioned powerful mitigating factors that counterbalance this. What were those? They seemed key to the final assessment.
Absolutely, and they are powerful. The most significant mitigating factor by far is the TPJF's unanimous and swift reversal of the INE's order on August 20th, 2025.
The unanimous part seems really important.
It is. It demonstrated unequivocally that Mexico's constitutional protections for free speech are indeed effective and robust, at least at that highest judicial level. And crucially, it showed that the system does have viable mechanisms to correct institutional overreaches when they occur. The fact that the highest electoral court unanimously upheld freedom of expression is a very strong affirmation of those fundamental principles.
So the system corrected itself, in a way.
In this case, yes. While the initial incident was deeply concerning, it ultimately sparked a necessary public and high-level debate on the proper application of gender-based violence laws and their boundaries. And importantly, it did so without causing permanent harm to democratic processes because the censorship was undone. The content was restored, and the precedent set by the TPJF actually leans strongly towards a balanced enforcement, one that prioritizes free speech alongside protection rather than sacrificing one for the other.
So the overall conclusion then is that while it was a concerning moment, a misuse of the law initially, it wasn't severely detrimental in the long run precisely because of the system's corrective action. Is that fair?
I think that's a fair assessment based on the report. While concerning and negative in highlighting the potential misuse of a vital law, the incident is likely not severely detrimental overall precisely because of its timely and unanimous reversal. It can largely be viewed as a correctable error.
A correctable error.
Yeah, and arguably an error that, in fact, might have strengthened legal precedents for the balanced enforcement of these laws moving forward. It put a very bright spotlight on the need for precise legal definitions and applications, and it demonstrated that the judiciary can and will act as a guardian of constitutional rights against administrative overreach.
But there's a caveat, right? The report warns it could have been much worse.
Absolutely. The report is clear in cautioning that its severity could have escalated dramatically if things had gone differently. If similar cases were to go unchecked in the future, meaning if the TDGF had not intervened, or if its decision had been less decisive, or if lower courts started upholding this kind of censorship, then the damage could be profound. So the potential for harm remains if vigilance isn't maintained.
So it really served as a flashpoint then, didn't it? An important crucible moment in this ongoing national conversation in Mexico.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. This incident serves as a critical flashpoint in Mexico's evolving and often complex balance between achieving gender equity and protecting freedom of speech. It strongly urges the need for refined guidelines and clear, consistent application of these VPMRG laws for future cases to avoid these kinds of conflicts.
So clarity is key.
Clarity and consistent application are key. In essence, it's a powerful lesson in how robust judicial oversight is absolutely essential to prevent laws designed for protection from inadvertently becoming tools of suppression, particularly in a vibrant but sometimes volatile democracy like Mexico's.
So you're left with a balanced, quite nuanced perspective then. You recognize the inherent dangers in restricting speech even when the intentions might seem good, while also appreciating the systemic checks and balances that, in this case at least, ultimately upheld freedom of expression. It's a powerful reminder, isn't it, that democracy is an active, ongoing process. It's constantly being tested, challenged, and hopefully, through cases like this, refined.
Well said. It's never static.
Well, this deep dive into the Delgado versus INE case has really, I think, illuminated the delicate balance that's at play when protecting fundamental rights in a dynamic democracy like Mexico. We've seen how quickly a factual report can become a battleground, and how crucial clear legal frameworks, precise application by authorities, and independent judicial oversight are to navigating these increasingly complex waters.
And it leaves us with a lingering question, doesn't it? In a world that's just overflowing with information, where the lines between legitimate political criticism, personal attacks, and even this concept of violence can seem increasingly blurred, how do we, as citizens, how do you determine where that line truly lies?
That's a tough one.
It is. And how do we ensure that laws designed to protect the vulnerable, a vital goal, don't inadvertently end up silencing the very voices that hold power accountable, thereby weakening the transparency that democracy absolutely relies upon? It's a challenge for every society grappling with these issues.
A truly thought-provoking question for you, our listeners, to consider. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the complex intersection of media, law, and politics in Mexico. We really hope it's given you a clearer, more nuanced understanding of this vital conversation and maybe something to reflect on. Until next time on The Deep Dive.